Welcome back into another episode of the Eden to Eden podcast. Hey, on today's episode, what do weed eaters, swords, and kisses have to deal with each other? You're going to find out. You're going to have to stick around if you want to know, but you won't have to stick around very long because we're getting ready to start right now. Well, to put your mind at ease early here, the weed eater part of the intro, although I guess depending on what part of the country or the part of the world you're tuning in from, some people tend to call it a weed whacker. We call it a weed eater here, but the reason why I introed that is as I'm filming this, my neighbor or somebody over here to my left is doing their yard work or something. So hopefully the microphone here tunes that out, but I can hear it. So it's on my mind now. The swords and kisses part, you're going to have to stick around to find out. We are indeed moving on in our next part of the Passion Week here, although I suppose technically I'm not really covering the week. It's more so the night before. And then we're going to cover a little bit after Jesus' resurrection in this series. But we're moving on to part 2 of it, which is just going to be about the arrest today. The betrayal by Judas and the arrest. Spoiler alert, Jesus is betrayed by Judas. And we're going to read some passages and make some connections. And we're going to spend an entire episode here talking about just the betrayal and arrest, which has been fascinating to look at and connect some of the dots. And so we're going to do that today. Per the usual, I'm going to read a passage for us. And per the usual, again, I'm going to ask that if you're driving or operating any kind of machinery or anything like that, you just kind of listen along as I read the passage. But if you are able to read along with me, I would always encourage that. Last time we were in the book of Mark. Today we're going to give Matthew some love. I don't know if you have been watching The Chosen at all. I know there's some hot opinions out there going both ways of The Chosen. I like watching The Chosen. I think it's good. As I've been watching it, Matthew, the disciple in The Chosen, has become my favorite. I know we probably shouldn't have favorites. That's terrible. But over the course of watching it for 3 or 4 seasons now, Matthew has become my favorite, which I know is odd because they kind of took some liberties with Matthew's character and changing and interpreting it in different ways. But hey, it is what it is. He's become one of my favorites. I love that guy. So we're going to read out of Matthew's gospel today. We talked last episode about the time that Jesus spent in the Garden of Gethsemane and some of the things taking place there, namely that Jesus has commenced and has started his part of the completion with that number 3 that we traced through several parts of the Garden of Gethsemane. And we saw that the 3 is very important in the Bible and in this particular passage that we read last week. And so we're going to pick up after that. Jesus has just told his disciples that were praying with him or supposed to be praying with him to get up because he's about to be handed over to the hands of sinners. And we're going to pick it up right there. So I'm going to read in Matthew, starting in chapter 26 today. And in verse 47, it reads like this. By the way, I'm reading out of the New American Standard Bible. Hopefully, whatever Bible you're accustomed to or you read from is at least somewhat similar to what I read. But if you were wondering, I'm reading out of the NASB. And it reads like, while he was still speaking, behold, Judas, one of the 12, came accompanied by a large crowd with swords and clubs. There's swords. So we covered the weed eaters, or the weed whacker. Now there's the swords, who came from the chief priests and elders of the people. Now he who was betraying him gave them a sign saying, whomever I kiss, there it is, the trifecta. There's the 3, weed eaters. I know my numbers. Weed eaters, swords, and kisses. We covered it right there. Verse 49, immediately Judas went to Jesus and said, Hail, Rabbi, and kissed him. And Jesus said to him, Friend, do what you have come for. Then they came and laid hands on Jesus and seized him. And behold, one of those who were with Jesus reached and drew out his sword and struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his ear. Then Jesus said to him, Put your sword back into its place, for all those who take up the sword shall perish by the sword. Or do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? Verse 54, how then will the scriptures be fulfilled, which say, that it must happen this way. At this time, Jesus said to the crowds, "Have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me? You would again, as you would against a robber? Every day I used to sit in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me. But all this has taken place to fulfill the scriptures of the prophets." Then all the disciples left him and fled. Now, Matthew's a good storyteller here, so he uses a good, strong word, behold. And you don't often say the word behold, and I think we should start using that word more. I'm going to start using the word behold more. Usually when you say behold, you're drawing people's attention away from something and to something. You don't say behold and then something really dumb happens. You say the word behold because something is about to happen, something of a big caliber. And so Matthew does the same thing here. Behold, and then he introduces Judas to the scene. We've seen Judas at the Last Supper with the other disciples, but he disappears and he's not resurfaced yet until now. And so Matthew does a good word here. He writes a good word. Behold, here comes Judas again. We haven't seen this guy in a while. What's going on with him? And Matthew also makes note of here. It says, while he was still speaking, behold, Judas, one of the 12. So Matthew's bringing in a spiritual and emotional and friendship connection. This was one of the 12. What is he about to do? And it says that Judas is accompanied by a large crowd. Now, it's interesting when you read through the Gospels, really all four of them, crowds or large gatherings of people, they play a big part in what Jesus's ministry is comprised of. And so sometimes we see crowds that are believing groups of people that Jesus genuinely has compassion on. So he has compassion on the crowds or pity on the crowds, and he feeds them, or in whatever way he has compassion or pity on them and takes care of them. But we also see crowds that are groups of people who sort of get in the way. They're kind of looking for a show, and then something happens, and they're kind of a buffer between the religious leaders and Jesus. But the second group is the crowds that are really not surrendering their life to Jesus but in his ministry and in the gospel, but rather they are people who are just kind of around looking for a good show, or they need something from Jesus, but they're not really ready to surrender everything to him. And then here we have a third group of, sort of a way of looking at the crowds is that are hostile towards Jesus. And so the first question that we have for today on the episode is, which part of the crowd are you? Hopefully you're not part of the third crowd where you're just very hostile towards Jesus. We have groups of people like that in our world today. But really can you answer what part of the crowd are you, or which crowd are you? Are you one or two? Are you part of the crowd that genuinely has surrendered everything to Jesus because you recognize him as the Son of God, as Messiah, the one who takes away the sin of the world, and of whom our worship is worthy of, and our lives is to be surrendered to? Or are you part of the second crowd, the second group, that you're just kind of needing Jesus for when you need him, and then you try not to acknowledge him otherwise? Do you need a good show from Jesus? In other words, do you show up to church on Easter and Christmas, but you don't really need Jesus otherwise? Do you not really pray or read or acknowledge Jesus in any way until you need something? Maybe you haven't prayed in weeks. Maybe you haven't read your Bible in weeks, but yet you have a promotion that you're seeking, and so you pray for that. Or somebody gets sick, and you only acknowledge Jesus when you need him to do something for you. So I can't answer that for you, mainly because I don't know who you are watching right now. So which of those three part of the crowds are you? In the Gospels, crowds represent different things, but here, this is a hostile crowd coming to seize Jesus. The high priest the high priest at the time had police at his disposal. These were temple police. So they had people that could not effectively act as like a Roman soldier or anything like that, but they had a select group of people that could keep peace in the temple, or in this case, whom Caiaphas, the high priest at the time, could send to seize Jesus in this particular case. and he sends his slave or his servant, the high priest's servant, who we do know that his name is Malchus from John's gospel. He sends Malchus, which is a direct representation, the mouthpiece of Caiaphas himself. So it's really kind of like the slave of Caiaphas here is the one in charge. He represents Caiaphas, and he's sort of in charge of this temple police. But we also know, sorry, I forgot to silence my phone before I started. Whoops. It's silenced now, so don't worry. Accompanied with Judas and the servant Malchus of the high priest is a group of Roman soldiers. Now, we do know that this is happening around the time of the Passover, which is a Jewish feast, a Jewish festival, and as many people as could afford it and had the means to go, they would go to Jerusalem to celebrate one of the three major Jewish festivals, and the Passover is one of the main ones. So Jerusalem became even more so crowded during the times of these festivals. And so as a result, you have a lot of people. There could be time there where tempers rise in certain things, and there's disputes and riots might break out. And so Rome would send in a few more soldiers for these festivals to keep the peace in case something shows up. In fact, even Pontius Pilate, who does not live in Jerusalem, he's kind of around at this time. He would come down to make sure, as the governor, the appointed governor and overseer of this area by the emperor himself, he would come down and make sure nothing happened. We even know that Herod Antipas, who resides in the northern part of Israel, he comes down because he is tetrarch or a ruler of Galilee, but he comes down for the feast as well. So there's a lot of very important people, high-ranking people that are in Jerusalem at the time to make sure that everything is practiced well. There's no riots. There's nothing bad happen, no violence, nothing like that. And so we're told that in the book of John, we're told that all the way up to possibly a cohort of Roman soldiers are under this particular party or this group of the crowds that go with Judas and Malchus to seize Jesus. Now, it's not always, if you kind of look through extra biblical sources, the way they define cohort at times, it could be up to 600 people, 600 soldiers. But we also see in different biblical or extra biblical sources where that word cohort can mean as little as 200 soldiers. And so we don't really know how many exactly soldiers were a part of this party, but we have temple police. We've got the direct representative of Caiaphas. His name is Malchus. We've got Judas, and we've got quite a number of Roman soldiers who come out with clubs and swords and torches to light the way. And with this group is the betrayer himself, Judas, one of the 12, as Matthew reminds us. And it's odd when we think of the name Judas. Judas is just the Greek form of the word Judah. Judah is one of the 12 tribes of Israel. Judah is one of the 12 sons of Israel, or Jacob. Jesus is often referred to as the Lion of Judah. And so Judah takes a huge precedence, a huge importance in the story, the redemptive story that God is working out, namely through Jesus. The name Judah in Hebrew just means to praise, and it's a common Hebrew name. Jesus is a common Hebrew name. I guess during the intertestamental period, shortly after the Old Testament, perhaps you've heard of the Maccabean Revolt. This is where we get the celebration of Hanukkah. And the leader of that was Judas Maccabeus. And so a lot of people were naming their sons Judas in hopes that they might have a son that would be important and actually lead Israel back to a purely Israelic state or Jewish state. And so Judas was a common name, just means praise, and Jesus was a common name, Jesus coming from Joshua. So what Judas is actually going to do here is partly what he came to do was just to betray, or that word just means to hand over. He's going to hand over Jesus to this arresting party. And the way Jesus identifies it at the end of last episode, we saw that he's going to be handed over into the hands of sinners. And it's so ironic that Jesus is being handed over into the hands of sinners because this is the people that he's staking his claim via his ministry by. He is often associated with eating with tax collectors and sinners. He goes to sinners' houses. He's going to reach the sinners, and these are the very captivating audience that are going to be. He's going to be handed over to the hands of these sinners. Um, it's hard to know exactly how much 30 pieces of silver is today. We can get close. We do know that Judas sold out, betrayed, or handed over Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. And that translates to roughly 90 to $250 today. So this is not life-changing money that Judas is doing this for. It's for all that we can surmise, this is coming in at a little under $300, even as low as $90. And so this is not a huge lump sum. This is not like he can retire and never have to work again, and his kids will never have to work again. But he does agree to this deal with the arresting party and the chief priests. And the way that he's going to point this out is that he's going to lead this arresting party out to the garden. And he's going to identify Jesus, so there's no misconception of who it is, with a kiss. Now, here in Texas and here in America, it's very odd to greet each other with a kiss. However, in some parts of the world still today, and especially this was the custom in the ancient world, a kiss was a greeting of affection, something that friends would do, or in this case, it's not super abnormal for a teacher to greet a rabbi with a kiss. Maybe once on the cheek or on both cheeks, something like that. But he doesn't want anybody to misconstrue which one of these people in the garden is Jesus. And so the way he's going to do that is he is going to identify who Jesus is by greeting him with a kiss. In verse 49 of what we just read, it says, immediately Judas went to Jesus and said, "Hail, Rabbi," and that's when he kissed him. Now, if you read particularly Matthew and Mark, although it's kind of in all the Gospels, the Gospel writers across the board love that word immediately. If you go through your Bible and highlight how many times the word immediately is used, they love saying that word. And it's attributed to how Jesus conducted his ministry. Immediately, Jesus did this. Immediately, this happened. Immediately, Jesus did that. Immediately, he helped these people. Immediately, he did this to serve these people. He is serving and serving and serving until ultimately he dies from it. And so here, it's interesting. We have the word immediately again, but it's immediately Judas goes over and says, "Hail, Rabbi." Judas greets that word hail. Judas greets Jesus with kairo. The Greek verb kairo primarily means to rejoice or be glad. And this is sort of just kind of dripping with irony because we have Judas, whose name means praise, greets with hail, or this word kairo, which just means to rejoice or be glad. We've got in this narrative a lot of words that are good, positive words. However, that's the ironic part, is that we see a lot of evil, which is actually transpiring around these words. It's the Greek word hail just means to have a sense of inner joy or delight. It's almost like he's like delighted to be selling out his friend the way he is. And it's meant to be ironic. In fact, when we look over at Matthew 27, just one chapter over, this is as Jesus is being mocked. He's on trial. He's being mocked. And in Matthew 27:29, it says, "And after twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on his head and a reed in his right hand, and they knelt down before him and mocked him, saying, 'Hail, King of the Jews.'" The same word they're mocking Jesus with is the same word that Judas greets Jesus with. And so this is a lot of good words that are being, like, it seems like it should be joyful, but as we see the things that are actually happening around these words, we see that this is not great. In verse 50, Jesus refers to Judas as friend. The word for friend this word is only used 3 times. Now, we have another word that we use for friend, which is translated a whole bunch in the New Testament for friend. This particular word that Jesus retorts Judas's betrayal with is the word friend. And this particular word is only used 3 times, and it always is used to rebuke or correct. It carries the connotation of two-faced or being duplicitous, or like an imposter almost. And so while we have a lot of times that the word for friend is being translated. This particular one is a rebuke that Jesus is using to retort or rebuke Judas. And sort of like maybe a historical representation of this, it might hearken us back to, that's right, I said hearken, might hearken us back to Brutus and Julius Caesar. If you've ever heard of the story of Julius Caesar, the Ides of March, or that infamous death that he had, or maybe if you've just seen the Bill Shakespeare play, William Shakespeare, sorry to be confusing. There's not another Shakespeare out there. Bill, William, yeah. But you can remember as Julius Caesar is on his way, he's overthrown by this conspiracy, and he's stabbed multiple times. Ouchies. He's stabbed multiple times. And one of the ringleaders of this conspiracy is Brutus. And Brutus is known as time and time again, as we read different historians, Brutus is known as a friend to Julius Caesar. And in actuality, this is the same word that's used here, that's Matthew's written in Greek for friend. It's not the normal friend like a buddy or a chum. It's an imposter friend. And Brutus is known to Julius Caesar. Now, they seemingly get along great. They really are friends. But by the end of his life, Brutus proves to be a friend in the same way that Judas is a friend to Jesus. He's an imposter. And so even the famous words of Julius Caesar, when he's being stabbed and dying, he looks up and he says, "Et tu, Brute," you too, Brutus? You're one of these? I thought we were friends. Now, Brutus gets his. I don't know if you know this part of it, but Brutus is, after Julius Caesar dies, there's a vie for power, and everybody wants the power that Julius Caesar had. And Brutus kind of throws his name in the hat pretty unsuccessfully, I might add. And Brutus's own friends leave him, and they actually turn against him. And so he endures the same thing that he did to Julius Caesar, his friend. So in this particular passage, the guards and the soldiers are prepared for battle. They show up with swords. They show up with clubs. They're ready to do what they need, but they aim to only seize Jesus. And so they don't want a riot on their hands. Remember, that's why the soldiers are all there. They're there because they want to prevent riots. They don't want an upheaval going on, especially during the Passover, during this festival in which it's meant to be celebrated. And so their goal is to only seize Jesus. That's why Judas points at excuse me. That's why Judas points Jesus out with a kiss, because they only want him. And in fact, John Nolan, who's a theologian that I really respect, he is a great guy that I look at often when I'm trying to make sense of some things in the Bible. Good theologian, good commentator. And in his commentary on Matthew, John Nolan writes, "The intelligence on which the operation is based has made quite clear that Jesus is an irreplaceable leader. His movement will be nothing without him, so there is no need to make the disturbance greater than need be by rounding up the disciples." And so, as John Nolan's putting it, and as the gospel writers are letting us know, they only want to get Jesus, which doesn't sit well with the disciples at first. And this gets us into, my goodness, just a lot of fun and awfulness at the same time. I suppose it's fun because we're reading the story here, but it's also awful at the same time when in verse 51, "And behold, one of those who were with Jesus reached out and drew out his sword and struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his ear." Now we know from John's gospel that this disciple that does this is Peter. And as I've already made mention, the high priest slave, or the servant that is speaking and conducting this business on behalf of the high priest Caiaphas, his name is Malchus. And so Peter cuts off the ear of the slave of the high priest, of the one that's basically in charge. So to Peter's credit, he shouldn't be doing this. Let me say that off the start. He shouldn't be doing this, but to his credit, he went after probably the one that he needed to go after. It seems as though Malchus has got quite a bit of power in this particular scenario, in this situation. It seems like he's kind of the one that's directing everybody and acting on behalf of the high priest. So Peter probably gets the right one. Peter's resort to violence is somewhat understood. I mean, they're attempting to take away his rabbi, his teacher, his friend, the Messiah. They're attempting to take him away. So on the one hand, when you're caught up in the moment, you could kind of see Peter's resort to violence. But this also proves that Peter is attempting to seize control and do what he wants, ultimately showing his lack of understanding of Jesus' teachings that he must die, and Jesus' teaching on how to treat enemies. and that his kingdom is one of peace, not war and violence. And so, in fact, if we go over to Luke in chapter 6, this is in Matthew 2, but I want to quote Luke 6:27 and 28. Jesus says, "But I say to you who are listening, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, and pray for those who mistreat you." And so we can see by Jesus's actions when he heals Malchus that this is not the way that the gospel message is intending to go out. This is not the kingdom that Jesus is ushering in, where we fight back. And so along those words, that what I just quoted from Luke 6, I want to read it again, and I want to bring it into some application for today. And it says, "But I say to you who are listening, love your enemies." Jesus has gone through every possible temptation and hurt that we can imagine. And so those who might be slandering you at your place of work, those who might be slandering you on any kind of team you're a part of, those friends that have said things about you, that have done things to you, maybe it's a spouse, a friend, a neighbor, whatever it is, we're supposed to love our enemies. Now, hopefully your spouse is not your enemy, but you get the point that I'm going here, and do good to those who hate you. But those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. And so this is something we can learn right off the bat from Jesus's ministry, and namely his actions here in the garden, is that in order to be a light and a life and to be a part of the kingdom that he's ushering in, we cannot do so with violence. And sometimes our violence is actionable, it's physical, and sometimes our violence is mental. We can hurt people with our words. We can hurt people with our thoughts. How do you hurt someone with your thoughts? If you are meditating on evil things and hurtful thoughts towards others, it shows the condition of your heart, and that will eventually manifest itself into the physical. So if you continue to hate, slander, and hurt others with your thoughts and your mind, it will come to the forefront and become physical at one point in time. So just so you are aware of that, the Lord Jesus is very clear that out of the heart, the mouth speaks. And so our heart needs to be one of service and love and community and unity, not anything related to violence. And so just food for thought there. And so we have a strong rebuke again by Jesus, saying that this is not the way this kingdom is supposed to be ushered in. Now, the use of this word, sword that Peter uses, I want to give a little bit of context first to what's going on here. I'm going to turn back a little bit. I guess I know my Bible, not back. If I were to turn back from Matthew, I would go to Malachi, good old Malachi, but I need to go forward, is what I meant to say, to Luke chapter 22. And I'm going to just bring this here. And he said to them, this is Jesus talking about, talking to the disciples. Now, the context of this particular passage is they are they're reminiscing back to when Jesus sent them out by twos. He sent them out and he gave them power to heal. He gave them power to preach the gospel. And he told them, you don't need anything. You need to be dependent upon others to be hospitable to you. So don't take this, don't take that. You don't need this. And now they're reminiscing about it, but Jesus is letting them know that's kind of in the past. Now that the kingdom is being ushered along, things are going to be a little bit different. And so in Luke 22, and I'll start in 35, and he said to them, Jesus to the disciples, he said, "When I sent you out without money belt and bag and sandals, you didn't lack anything, did you?" And they said, "No, we didn't lack anything. We were taken care of." And this is where Jesus says, well, it's about to change. And he said to them in verse 36, "But now whoever has a money belt is to take it along likewise, also a bag, and whoever has no sword is to sell his coat and buy one." Yeesh. So basically, you need to get a sword. You need to be, even to the point of being cold, to selling your cloak. Here in my house today, which is where I am, we've got this thing cranked down. It is chilly right now, which is odd because outside, it's starting to warm up. We're in the throes of spring here, which just means in Texas that the wind kicks up and people's allergies it just is gnarly this time of year. The winds kick up and it's awful. But I'm inside now and it's cold. And Jesus is saying it's even worth being cold to go get a sword. Now, this is a very, very odd statement here. And so Jesus is saying, he was rebuking Peter for using a sword, but in this passage, he's saying, go get a sword. Now, everybody listen. I have looked and looked and looked to make sense of this passage. And it seems by everything that I can see that Jesus is being metaphorical here. He is not actually saying, go get a sword. So carry a sword seems to be a symbol or a metaphor for how challenging things will get. You used to be welcomed, but now that the gospel message is gaining ground, the kingdom is being ushered in, people are going to become hostile. They're going to join that third group and be hostile crowds towards you. And so whether I looked at Dr. Joel Green, Dr. Bach, Fitzmyer, and I, Howard Marshall, I got through a lot of sources. It just seems as though everybody thinks this is a metaphor for Jesus is saying, be ready, because it's about to be a lot harder to follow me. And even as we continue to read, Jesus is saying, go get you a sword, which is, remember, is a metaphor for be prepared for how hard it's going to be to follow me. And even the disciples say, look, Lord, here are 2 swords. And he said to them, it is enough. That doesn't mean, oh, you got 2 swords? Okay, that's good. That's not what it means. It is enough is an ancient way of dismissing a topic. It's like saying, enough from you. He's dismissing it. He's like, you're missing the point. You don't need swords. However, it seems as though Peter took it to heart, because from what we can tell by reading this, he drew his own sword to cut off the slave's ear, Malchus's ear. And so Jesus rebukes this, and the same is true for today. We can only overthrow evil and battle darkness with peace and service. In other words, the people down the street from me who are, far from the Lord, I can't go do something abusive and evil to them in order to win them over to this kingdom. The only way that I can win them over to the kingdom, through the power of the Holy Spirit, is to serve them and to bring peace to them. And so it's fascinating to see how Peter utilizes the words of Jesus to apparently go get a sword here. Now, going back to the word that's used here, Peter draws, the Greek word is machera, and it's a sword, or like a short sword, almost like a big dagger kind of a thing. Now, quick little rundown here. The Old Testament was written in Hebrew, was not written in English. Okay, English came around a long time after this. The Old Testament was predominantly written in Hebrew. Now, as kingdoms and empires came in and out, what we see is we have the popularization, or what's called Hellenization, which just means that the Greek culture became quite popular, particularly as Alexander the Great is making his empire bigger and bigger. And even in the Roman world, for a large chunk of the Roman Empire, they spoke Greek. Now you have people in the ancient world who are speaking Greek, but they can't read the Old Testament because it's in Hebrew. And so we had a group of people get together and they copied the Old Testament into Greek. And it's called the Septuagint. It's very old. And the Septuagint is just a copy of the Old Testament written in Greek, so that if you didn't live in Israel and you lived in different parts and you just spoke Greek, now you could read the Old Testament. And so that word machera is used in the Old Testament, in the Septuagint, and it's a word for short sword or a dagger, and it's the word used for making animal sacrifices. And so in the event that you needed to drain an animal of its blood, you would use a machera, this Greek word for sword or long dagger, to drain the animal of its blood and make the sacrifice. And in fact, Abraham uses a machera. When you go read Genesis 22 in the Septuagint, you see that same Greek word that Peter uses here against Isaac. So when he's called to sacrifice Isaac, and it's this very slow, Abraham reaches and grabs the machera, and he's going to be obedient and make this sacrifice of his son. And in that moment, Abraham's hand is stopped. He's holding the machera, the sword, the dagger, and God stays his hand. He keeps him from actually going through, knowing that Jesus will be the ultimate sacrifice one day. God is not going to withhold his son from the sacrifice, but rather he will allow it to happen. And here, Peter uses this sword or this sacrificial dagger to Jesus's disgust. to Jesus's disgust. The Machera is needed metaphorically. We need a sacrifice, but for Jesus' sacrifice to bring peace, not against these soldiers. We don't need this sacrificial knife, of so to speak, against these soldiers. I'm going to take care of the sacrifice, Peter. You put that away. We don't need that. Just before we move on entirely from this sword that Peter's using, you never thought we would talk so much about swords, did you? I love it. I love it and I don't at the same time. We don't need swords, but I enjoy a good sword fight. I'm going to I enjoy a good sword fight like on TV. I have never actually partaken of a sword fight. I imagine it could be quite dreadful. I need to pause for a coffee. Coffee will warm me up. I'm telling you, it's cold here for Texas. I'm proud of Texas. Anyways, I'm going to get back to it now. My ADHD session is over there. But before we leave the concept of this sword that Peter's using entirely, I do want to highlight something pretty neat. And for that, I'm going to turn to Acts chapter 12. And in Acts chapter 12, I'm going to read. Now, this is going to tie in this word that Peter's using for sword, or I guess that Matthew's using for the word sword, and going back to Jesus's intercession for the three, wanting them to pray in the Garden of Gethsemane. And it says in Acts chapter 12, I'll start in verse 1. Now, about that time, Herod the king laid hands on some who belonged to the church in order to mistreat them. And he had James, the brother of John, put to death with a sword. And so there's a couple of things being highlighted here. This is the Machera. So James is going to ultimately be killed by this sword that Peter's trying to wield in the garden. But it also proves that James, the son of Zebedee, the brother of John, can indeed drink from the same cup that Jesus did. That cup that Jesus is going to bring is going to symbolize God's wrath, but it's also going to symbolize just death in general and hurt and pain. And while Jesus has absorbed God's wrath on our behalf, James does indeed prove himself worthy to drink from the cup that Jesus drank from. And so we see it come to fruition. Remember, Jesus was petitioning them to pray in the garden, strengthen yourselves, don't fall into temptation, don't deny me, don't run from the gospel message, don't run from the kingdom and from me. And here we see James put to death by the Machera, the same thing that Peter draws in the garden. And he does indeed drink from the cup that Jesus drank from. So it's fascinating to see all these things come to fruition. Now, before we move on entirely, I do have to turn over to John chapter 18 real quick. And I know I'm running out of time, but I mean, you can pause this thing and carry on later when you're going for your walk or in your car or whatever. But I do want to read or make mention of John 18. So we have to take a quick jaunt over there, and that's where we really see Judas getting hold of this cohort and bringing a large group of people. Now, with this group of people, they're said to have clubs, swords, there's swords again, and torches. John's gospel is portraying this scene a lot different than Matthew, Mark, and Luke are, which is very common for John. In fact, roughly 93% of John's gospel, what he writes, is different than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Even when they include the same accounts, John's account is very different. They're telling the same thing. We're still getting the same story, but his gospel is just so different. And in that, he is really focused on Jesus's divinity in the garden and specifically here under his arrest. And so in verse 4 of John chapter 18, it says, "So Jesus, knowing all things that were coming upon him, went forth and said to them," the arresting party, this group of soldiers and temple police, "Whom do you seek?" And they respond, they said, "We're seeking Jesus the Nazarene." And he said to him, "I am he." Now we see in John's gospel quite often Jesus say the words "I am." So ego eimi in the Greek can mean "I am he," but it could also mean "I am." And I think it's translated most properly in some of the context in John as "I am." And this is a very divine statement that he is making. And so I do want to paint the picture this way. Imagine this arresting party, this group of men come with torches. Now, I highly doubt all 200 or less than 200, how many are there? I highly doubt all of them had torches, but they have quite a few torches, enough to light up their way in the dark of the ancient world to find this man that they need to find. And it would not make sense for Jesus to be here. And sorry if you're listening, this is not great audio, but if Jesus is standing there, the arresting party would not come up just to face him. They would want to cut off his escape. I'm assuming they would want to cut off his escape. And so as soon as they identify this as him, they would surround him. Namely, after Judas has done the betrayer's kiss, now they know who it is. They would surround him, cutting off his means of escape, because they really need to seize control of this guy. And so really you have Jesus in the middle of this group of people that have surrounded him with fire. So we have Jesus, who is God, right there, surrounded by fire. And from this group of flames, from this fire, we hear "I am" come out. This is just very, very reminiscent of God communicating to Moses in the burning bush in Exodus. And then the people in the arresting party in John tells us that they fell back and then fell back in fear. And I think what's happening here is they are awestruck by the divinity. We see this at the Transfiguration, where this metamorphosis, this inside of Jesus comes out and his glory is shining because he is indeed God. And I think there's such power here that he is exuding the power and divinity of God, and they're struck by that, and it causes them to stumble. And so it's fascinating to see it is inevitable that this "I am" statement has a double entendre here, like I'm Jesus. This is self-identification, but at the same time, I am. And this is a self-acclamation or self-identification of I am indeed God. And it's cool here in John's gospel, he speaks up on behalf of the disciples. He says, "You came for me. I'm not going to put up a fight. Let these guys go." And then it seems like when we harmonize Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Jesus pleads for them to leave, and they do in fact flee. So Jesus has told them, you all will flee one day. There's coming a time when all of you will flee, and ultimately tells Peter, you're going to outright deny me. And so, sorry, going back to Matthew in chapter 26. Also, sorry I licked my fingers, but I got to get the pages turned here. So if you saw that, it's kind of gross, but don't worry. I'll wash my hands before I shake your hand. Don't worry. So getting back to Matthew chapter 26, picking it up in verse 52, then Jesus said to them, "Put your sword back into its place, for all those who take up the sword shall perish by the sword." Jesus is rebuked to get rid of the sword. And it actually is interesting. All those who take up the sword shall perish by the sword. If you resort to violence, it will ultimately be your demise, physically or spiritually or emotionally. So Jesus is saying, Peter, you don't want to be a part of this team that emphasizes violence. Rather, you want to be a part of my kingdom that emphasizes peace and service. And even if you were to become a violent person, it could stand to reason that you don't die by violence or in a fight or something like that. But if you are consistently engaging in violent behavior, you are a violent person. And being a violent person overtakes your thoughts, your emotions, your spiritual life, your feelings, everything. And that will inevitably enact in your physical life. And so if you're a violent person with your thoughts and you meditate on being violent and you hurt people with your words, again, this is coming back to what we've been talking about. It will eventually manifest itself into the physical, and you will act the way you feel and the way you think. And so Peter's being told, don't be a part of this. So all who take up the sword will perish by the sword. In verse 53, or do you think I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? Legion is the Roman term, and at different points in the Roman Empire, it represented either 5,000 to 6,000 soldiers. Here, I think it's probably 6,000. And so he says, Peter, if I really needed help fighting these guys, I could call 12 legions of angels to do my bidding for me. In other words, I could call down 6,000 angels per each one of you disciples. I'm good. Put your sword back where it goes. In 54, how will then the scriptures be fulfilled, which say that it must happen this way? Jesus knows he has to die, and now he's fighting against his own disciples who are fighting against the arresting party. He's got to seize full control of this in order to make sure that he actually does die. It's a weird state of emotions that's going on here. He's basically saying, you're Jews and you don't understand that the Messiah must suffer this way. Go read your Bible again. Go read your Old Testament. The coming Messiah must suffer and go through all these things. In 55, he turns his attention back to the arresting party, and he says in 55, have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me as you would against a robber? That word robber is the same word used in the parable of the Good Samaritan, where Jesus is telling the story that a man fell amongst the robber, and the robber beat him up and killed him and left him on the side of the road and didn't take care of him. That's that same word. It means it's like a violent, there's that word violent again, or kind of like an outlaw. So Jesus is saying, are you likening me to that character in the story that just beats people up and causes a ruckus that way? That's not who I am. So the disciples flee in verse 56. Per Jesus's, he tells the arresting party in John chapter 12, in John's gospel. Sorry, I got kind of like mush mouth there. Sorry about that. You know what it was? I think I'm being distracted. I have a beagle dog, and our beagle dog can open doors. And so I have all the doors locked, I think, but I thought I would maybe hearing the dog try to come in. So if the dog comes in and you get a glimpse of the beagle, more power to you. But John makes Jesus fully in charge of this arresting scene, and he says, let these guys go. And then they do run away and flee. And in Zechariah 13:7, this is a fulfillment of that particular passage from the Old Testament. It says, awake, O sword, there's our word sword again, against my shepherd, meaning it's time for the Messiah to die. Awaken, O sword, it's time against my shepherd. Strike the shepherd and the sheep will scatter. Going back to our John Nolan quote, that if we can get the shepherd, everybody else will run away and flee. And that's exactly what happens. And so a lot of good takeaways from this. I never want to sit here and say you should get this out of this. Sometimes it's just a matter of reading what the Bible says and allowing the Holy Spirit to work in your heart the way he sees fit. And so there are things that this does for me. But there are also things that it might be different for you. Even the same word of God is true each and every day. But I just want to encourage you to reread this and just be moved by the power of Jesus and what he is. He is not letting anyone delay or stop him from being killed. He's giving himself up willingly and inviting you, if you're not already a part of this gospel, already a part of this redemptive plan that he is working out, this kingdom that he's ushering in. It is one of peace and not one of violence. And so let that be in your hearts and in your minds. And you know what? I'm going to get back to this coffee and dismiss you all. I'm going to go try to endure this Texas spring with all the allergies kicking up. You know, next time we're going to talk about the trial, the courtroom scene, so to speak, that Jesus goes through. And you know what? I can't wait. So until next time, cheers, and we'll see you next time on the Eden to Eden podcast.